waiting room, but we'll give it one more minute and then we'll get going. All right, why don't we get going? So thanks everybody. Thanks for taking some time out of your evening to join us here tonight. Just so you are aware, this meeting is being recorded. We actually recorded, this is the second of these webinars. We did one yesterday during the afternoon. That recording is actually already up on our YouTube page. This meeting will be recorded and will eventually be posted there as well. But thanks again for joining us here for to talk cumulative impacts rules. This is our midpoint check-in webinar. We're about a year and a half into this process, so we're going to cover a couple of things today. And what we're starting with will be sort of some of the basics. So think of this webinar as a last season on cumulative impacts. If you've missed what we've been talking about, or you're just joining into the process for the first time, this is a perfect time to do it if you want to be involved moving forward. This webinar will kind of give you the summary of all of the stuff that we've done over the last year and a half. What we'll be covering is a short little detour into the process itself, kind of give you how rulemaking works, the basics of it, kind of the general applicability, what we're working with for this rulemaking. And then we'll go into what's happened in 2023 and 2024, what's happened over this last year and a half, before we talk looking ahead, what's going to be in 2025 and beyond. So in that part, we'll talk a little bit about upcoming engagement efforts that we're planning or that we're working on. We'll continue to talk through what some of the conceptual areas of this rule might look like, and we'll give you a little preview of the rulemaking steps. If you haven't been a part of a formal rulemaking, there's a lot of administrative steps that will at least give you the preview of what that would look like in 2026. So let's start here. If this is the first time participating as part of a rulemaking, welcome, enjoy. If not, this might be a little bit of a refresher. So thanks for bearing with us as we help others. But we have a web page, and you can follow both either typing it in or that QR code that you see on the screen. You can find our proposed rules webpage, which has not only this cumulative impacts rule, but any rules that MPCA is working on. So whether that is air, land, or water, you can find those rules and materials on that webpage there. The cumulative impacts webpage in particular, this is where we will post our various materials, documents, comments that we've received over time, different meeting materials, recordings of those meetings or webinars. Those will all be posted here. And that also includes a link to sign up to receive updates. So if you somehow got onto this webinar without being signed up for that list, amazing. And if you'd like to stay updated into the future, please do go sign up to receive updates. That'll be the best ways to make sure you get the updates the same time as everybody else. And I think I have forgotten to introduce myself, so I'm going to briefly back up. I'm Hassan Boucherab. I'm an engineer in our air policy unit here at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I'm the person coordinating this overall rulemaking. I'm also a little sick, so bear with me. I might mute myself to cough a little bit, drink some tea in between things. But we'll get there. We'll get to the end of this presentation together. So basics of the rules, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but there's a lot of steps that are a part of a rulemaking, and there's a lot of opportunities for public participation, and those are the couple of things I've highlighted in blue. We started this rule as we start every rule, which includes a request for comments, where we start the initial kickoff. We give people the idea that we're working on. We're asked for comments on that idea to get things going. The number of asterisks that you see both on that request for comments and that public comment period later, these are parts of the rules that have specific deadlines for cumulative impacts in particular. Because this rule came out of the legislature as something we were tasked with doing, we had 60 days once that bill was signed into law to get that request for comments started. So that's why that request for comments was pretty broad. There wasn't a lot of information, specifics, or details for people to think about at that time because we had to get it out in 60 days. But from the start, we'll go through a handful of steps, which include, like tonight, a bunch of informational or public meetings that we'll ultimately use to help us put together what the draft rules and the statement of need and reasonableness is. Essentially, a document that describes the why behind what the rules we're proposing look like. Once we get to that stage, we will eventually have to put these proposed rules out for notice. That'll be in the notice of intent to adopt. That'll happen here a little bit later, but we also have a deadline for that. We have 36 months to get there, but after that, we'll have a public hearing. As part of that comment period, this is where we will talk in front of an administrative law judge as part of this process. There will be opportunities to comment both at the hearing and after the hearing, all leading up to essentially the final rule. So what happens between those hearings or that hearing and the final rule is we'll respond to all the comments that we receive. We'll prepare a formal document called the Order Adopting Rules, which is ultimately reviewed all the way up through the governor's office, signing off before it then goes back to the Office of Administrative Hearings, where they review all of our work and say yay or nay to the rules before we eventually publish the final set of rules. So there's a lot of steps that goes into this, and we're about, halfway through our time, and we're on that like third step right now. So talking cumulative impacts in particular, just want to acknowledge at the start that this rule got started due to the advocacy efforts of a wide variety of people. So this rule came about as a result of people asking and pushing for more. So what this rule is going to cover is a handful of things. And kind of big picture, we're looking to address Minnesotans' disproportionate exposure to pollutants, essentially looking at environmental justice areas. And where these rules will apply and who they'll apply to is for certain air permit applications in environmental justice areas around Minnesota. What we received from the legislature as part of the bill that was signed into law was an outline, some specifics, but the legislature tasked MPCA with defining and establishing a lot of the different parts of this rule. So this isn't something that was fully formed at the time, and we are tasked with creating it. And so we're talking to you all as we do that to bring you along for the process. And we have a deadline to get this. The legislature essentially gave us 36 months, which is to get to that notice of intent to adopt or that proposed rule, which works out to be roughly May 2026 of when we will be giving that first look of what these rules will look like. So a little bit more detail, these rules, where they apply, who they apply to. This is not all environmental justice areas in Minnesota, but it's some environmental justice areas plus a 1-mile buffer around them that are in the 7-county Twin Cities metro area, plus cities of the first class, which is a very legislative term. Right now, it means Rochester and Duluth, but the term generally means any city with 100,000 people or more recorded as part of the last 10-year census. And this applies to major, or sometimes you'll hear us talk about them as Title V or Part 70, um, and state permit applications, air permits in particular. This will include new facilities, so somebody coming in and doing, a brand new place, expansions, so somebody might be changing what they're doing at their facility, or reissuing a permit. Several permits in Minnesota expire over time, roughly every 5 years. And so those permits are also subject to these rules, or will potentially be subject to these rules. And if you're curious about who might be subject, we do have sort of a list available that's roughly 105 facilities in those areas, in environmental justice areas, that have these types of permits. This is not a end all be all list, but this is our best guess as of today who might be um, brought into these rules once they're finalized. So now this isn't just in those areas, right? We do have environmental justice areas around Minnesota, like you can see. And this is actually a definition that the legislature put together as part of this law. So an area in Minnesota can be considered, or is an environmental justice area if it meets one of these 4 criteria. So it's not a combination. It could be a single one of these. It could be 40% more of the population is non-white, 35% or more are low income, or below 200% of the federal poverty level, roughly $60,000 for a family of 4. There could be limited English proficiency, so that if there's a roughly 40%, or if there is 40% or more of the people in that area over the age of 5 with limited English skills, or the area is considered Indian country, which is a definition in U.S. code. And you can kind of see those areas identified across the geography of Minnesota. It doesn't matter which one you like an area might be. Any one of them qualifies as an environmental justice area. But since we're talking about the metro and Duluth and Rochester, let's zoom in just a little bit here. So now we've taken out sort of the distinctions and we've just kind of put them all together on a map, with exception, you can see sort of the tribal land over in Scott County of the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux. But you can see, this is spread around the counties. It's not all of the counties, but it's a good portion. It's about half of the area or so, or half of the counties. Now, when we look at Duluth and Rochester, sort of a similar story. You can kind of see where those areas are. It's not the entirety of either city, but it's maybe about 2/3 of Duluth, maybe about a little over half of Rochester are considered environmental justice areas. So just giving you a sense of where these rules might apply. And if you've been following along with us throughout this process, you can see, this is a graphic you might be familiar with. If not, this kind of gives you a good overview of what, almost like the whole process, what we have to come up with. The first 2 parts, let's see here, sort of these 2 little areas, the permit types and locations, those are defined. Those are easy. The legislature told us what that is, or what those areas are, who's a part of it. But then the rest of it, the next 6 steps, are all things that you can see we are tasked with creating, defining, establishing a whole host of different information as part of this process. And that's what we've been up to for roughly the last year and a half. So let's give you sort of that little recap. First and foremost, thank you if you have been participating. Minnesotans have put a lot of time and effort into this so far, whether it's comment letters, attending webinars or work sessions or meetings, having individual conversations. I've talked to numerous people at this point about this rule. You might have talked to some of the other folks on the team here that are working on this. So again, want to thank you. This is not a insignificant task to participate and uh, be a part of this rulemaking process. So this webinar, what we're trying to do is highlight the feedback that you've given us so far so you can see and understand how ideas have grown and kind of hopefully you can see um, how your feedback has helped influence what we're talking about today. Like I said, we have a lot to come up with. We're about halfway through, and so we're going to kind of cover these different steps. So, we'll go back to 2023. We'll talk about the request for comments, kind of the big ideas and themes that we heard from there, some of those meetings that we held. We'll talk a little bit about then the work that came after that. So, the co-learning webinars, the working sessions that we had, different conversations and work to get to where we are today before we eventually go towards that May 2026 notice of intent to adopt. So in July through October is when we had that request for comments. We asked for input on the general areas the legislature defined. So if you think about that little graphic of 8 different parts, we just basically asked people, what should we know? What do you think we should do here, given these directions that we've received from the legislature? We got a lot of comments, a big turnout here. About 360 comment letters during that request for comment period came in across um, meetings, submitted directly, written comments that were emailed to us. So, again, kudos to you all for helping influence this process. And we gave, if you want to see, there's far too much to summarize right now or to go into detail, but if you do want to see a little bit more detail of what we heard then. We did give a webinar back in November of 2023 where we summarized those comments and we kind of previewed where we were going for 2024 with the idea of co-learning webinars and work sessions. So we're kind of doing a reprise of that and summarizing big picture today, what we've heard over this last year and a half in total. So quickly though, what we heard in that request for comments, big picture, we didn't have a lot of details, so people were really emphasizing things like outreach and engagement, doing more outreach, more engagement, and doing it better. We've been attempting to do that. We think we're certainly doing more than the average rulemaking. And people were also looking for accessibility and transparency. Make sure people can participate, make sure that we can understand any decisions that are being made, um, make sure there's clear guidelines, explanation for those decisions as well. Things like outreach and engagement, beyond just doing more and doing more better, trying to do something simple, like make summaries of the feedback that you have received available. This is, things we've been doing, we've kind of been learning as we go here. This was a request that happened too not so long after one of the webinars where people really wanted to see summaries of what we talked about during that webinar. Sure. Talking some other areas, big areas, people did give us, so not just large ideas on outreach and engagement, but folks did also offer some ideas of things we should think about for the cumulative impacts analysis themselves. Like if we're tasked with creating what those look like, well, can you create them to also be accessible and understandable by the public? Can you reference existing work that's out there, making it inclusive, bringing people and other programs into the process so it's not sort of this standalone thing. Things like community benefit agreements, again, the content that we have to and the process for entering into those. People suggested how do we think about those, how to make those accountable? How do we make those enforceable? What are the types of benefits or what types of information should this community benefit agreement include? Who should be involved? Who is community? Who decides what that is, and who community is as part of this benefit agreement? So like I said, from there we went into some webinars and work sessions. This was kind of our, big picture. We have to figure out what we're doing here too. So how about we bring people along at the same time? People asked for more outreach and engagement. So how about we do it this way? We have to learn. So let's learn alongside people as well. So we did some webinars where we brought in external experts from other states or other regions to share how they've been doing similar work or implementing similar rules. Um, so we can think about like, all right, somebody else has created a wheel elsewhere. What can we use that wheel here as well? How can we make that work in Minnesota? And then from there, we went into working sessions. So beyond once we've sort of dipped our toe into what we think we might want to do, let's start talking about those areas in a little bit more detail. So this is where now we had people from MPCA do presentations. We did have people help do outside facilitation. We brought in a consulting firm to help us out here, DeYoung Consulting. And this was a stage where we were still concepts, right? Really early drafts. We don't have a great idea, a perfect idea of what we're going to do. We certainly didn't have all the questions figured out or answered, but let's talk about that as well and maybe figure out where we can go by learning together, learning from the experience, learning from the input that and the questions that people asked as part of the co-learning webinars. Um, to make sure we're not like starting over each time. You've all have told us something previously. We've noted that, and we're trying to bring that all together as we keep moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about those webinars. Not tons of detail, but if you want to see them, again, we do have those recordings available. You can see the January, March, and April. You can find these webinars as well as this recording on our YouTube page. Um, but January is where we talked with New Jersey and sort of their version. They not quite cumulative impacts, but New Jersey is about a couple years ahead of where we are. They created their own environmental justice rule. Um, and that's pretty similar with what we are tasked with doing here in Minnesota. So we can benefit a little bit by looking at what somebody else has done, do a little creative plagiarism and try and benefit and learn from where they are as we move forward. March, we talked data gathering and how programs in Colorado and Washington, D.C. do similar programs, how they look at data, analyze data as part of their programs. April, we talked with sort of a community benefit agreement focus. So not necessarily that term, but how these different sort of community-centered agreements were developed, enacted in places like Flint, Michigan. We had a company come and speak about they help different development projects think about being locally minded and bringing those sorts of terms into the contracting process, the design process, so it's thought of inherently. So learning from all of these people to understand and all of these programs to understand what do we like? Can we use that same sort of idea? And then in May, we sort of gave a quick overview of we've spent some more time thinking about this. Here's how we think the rule is going to look, or sort of an overview of the rule. Here's the preview of what we think we're going to talk about in some of the working sessions. Um, let's start getting into how we think about what we need to create, what we need to focus on here in Minnesota, instead of just the other examples. What are the materials that we need to create? What's the information that we want to share? So I thought these webinars were pretty great, went pretty well overall. We averaged about 100 people in each webinar, each of those 3 to 4 webinars. There was a ton of conversations, ton of questions that came up, and this was really helpful. So thank you to those who showed up. This really helped identify the areas where people were interested and helped really influence what we talked about in those work sessions. So things like, what are the stressors that are important here in Minnesota? um, how do we involve people both in this rulemaking during this 3-year time frame plus afterwards? how do we think about, one topic in particular that I wanted to highlight is how do we incorporate something like lived experience? So if I'm a community member and I'm not a technical expert or something like that, how do I participate in this process without feeling like I have to write a research paper or something? How can I share just, well, this is my experience. How does that matter for something like this program? Which is a really good question and something I'll talk about a little bit later. So from here, from those webinars, then we went into the work sessions. So we did 5 of these from July through November of this last year. Um, excuse me. We held these about once a month on different topics. Our goal here was to really hopefully have a good discussion, meaningful discussion with the people who showed up, the participants. So to help let people who did show up know, again, you're taking time out of your day to talk to us. We want you to understand how your feedback is going to be used and how we're thinking about what everybody is telling us to help us create the different parts of this rule and figure out how to refine those different parts. We also offered an informal comment period for those who wanted to provide written comments, either if they were at the meeting or if they were unable to attend. We put all of those different materials and handouts and comments that we received on our webpage as well. So if you're curious and you want to see what we talked about at any of these webinars or sort of specific comments that others might have had, you can go find those on our website as well. I'm going to give you the quick summary here in just a second of each webinar. But these topics generally ranged from the data that we might include, talking all things community benefit agreements, how do we think about those benchmarks, the information, the lines that help us understand who has to do a cumulative impacts analysis or not. Again, really good attendance here. About 20 to 60 people attended each working session. And these were really helpful to get into the details, really start thinking about the specifics in each situation. Um, as a quick note, we kind of as we were looking at this, we saw roughly, about 2/3 of attendees at those meetings were those with a professional interest. So this might have been part of their job, or part of their job to attend this meeting, or they had a professional interest in it they might have been a regulated party, a facility, or a consultant, or something like that. Um, I just wanted to note that for you, and then that'll be relevant as we talk about our engagement planning moving forward. But for a quick walkthrough of each work session, in July, we started talking about data and indicators. And this was sort of our first idea of what's the information that we're going to include as part of this analysis. What do we want people to look at? How do we narrow it down? Because there's a lot of data out there and you can't look at everything. So what's the most important stuff? What's the things that matter here for us in Minnesota? So what we started with is, you all gave us a bunch of input on different issues, pollutants, concerns, things that mattered to you. So we heard that. We heard from, what New Jersey did in their program, and we have our own experience and expertise here in MPCA about using the different data that we could use, how we could analyze that data. Um, Big picture here, what we heard, people who attended generally agreed with the categories and sort of information that we shared, but people wanted more detail to better understand what are we actually including. How do we decide which data to include and why did that data make the cut versus some other data didn't? And this wasn't just data in this nebulous term, but it was things like what's the neighborhood and pollution concerns? What's what is the thing that if I imagined I lived in this neighborhood, if I live in Rondo, or if I live in Frogtown or South Minneapolis, what are the things that I care about there? And how do I bring that into this larger process? So how do I bring community into it? How do a couple other concerns that people brought up were, um, again, how do you define community? Is this how you might define your neighborhood or your community different than, a person down the street from you, right? There were other ideas and sort of suggestions or concerns that people raised, like, well, what about things like non-expiring permits? Can you make meeting materials and recordings available, like I mentioned a little bit earlier? So, there's a lot of information, and if you want, a better summary of what we heard at each of these meetings, again, I would encourage you to go check out the summary documents that we have on our webpage. They're not too long. They're maybe 2 or 3 pages total for each session. So August, we talked community benefit agreements. Um, we shared our initial ideas here about how do we bring community. Can you hear me still? Are we back?
We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. My headphones are doing something funky. Um, but anyway, so we talked about community benefit agreements. How do we bring community into this process? Um, what are the different types of benefits or different types of categories of benefits that we could consider? And what else do we include? So, we're talking about benefits that might be in this agreement. There might be other parts of that, back to that accountability question that people had. How do we hold regulated parties and MPCA accountable for what's in this agreement? So again, we looked back to, what we had heard from our webinars, both from a community focus, a facility planning focus, and then we looked, we've done our own research here, and we did our research into what other states and other places have done in community benefit agreements or similar. Again, quick takeaways, people generally supported the types of benefits that we summarized. But there was a handful of suggestions and concerns as well. So, when we're talking about engagement, people really said you got to use a variety of methods. It can't just be necessarily, a public notice and a public comment period. So use something different. Think about different media, different community organizations, messengers, things like door knocking or door mailers, different platforms, whether it's mail or email or social media or something else. And then suggestions too of this is going to be difficult. What if could we create something as we go where we can sort of collect ideas? Like, what have other places done so people can get an idea of, well, how about that? Does this make sense? There were some concerns here too about, lots of concerns in trust with drafting or approving that community benefit agreement. Um, if we're thinking engagement and this process, again, how do we make this accessible? And then, two, in addition to making it accessible, how do we decide what's the end point here? When, how much money or how much benefits does a community benefit agreement have to provide in relation to what's going on, right? So there's a lot of things to think about that we are, this information that you're sharing with us is making its way into what we're cooking up to share with you in a little bit. So September, we talked benchmarks, and this was the idea of basically when is a cumulative impacts analysis needed? And the statutes kind of contemplate it, and we kind of talked about it in two different ways of that make sense in my mind. There's some cases where it's mandatory, and there's some cases where it's discretionary. We looked at, again, those co-learning webinar examples. We have examples of mandatory and discretionary thresholds in our own rules already for things like air permitting, for environmental review. We have discretionary look analyses for environmental review and air emissions risk analysis, something MPCA does to look at health risk and cancer risk. And we have a petition process in Minnesota rule already as an example. So as we thought about these things and shared these ideas with folks, again, people generally found it pretty hard to weigh in on, what's mandatory or discretionary when you don't know what the other one is, um, which is fair. Um, we're trying to figure that out too. But I think, good good suggestions came out of this of we think you should focus on a handful of different factors, whether it's social, economic, community, health, or environmental. Um, and if if it doesn't make it into one of the categories, it feels like it makes sense that it might make its way into the other category. So this was another area too where we thought about how do we make lived experience, right? So there's part of this, especially for the petition process, and one way to answer when a cumulative impacts analysis is required, contemplates this idea of material evidence. Basically, just something, a justification to help support the need for doing one of these analyses. So, how could lived experience be a part of that? How could something like that's not hard numbers be a part of this process? So we got some good ideas or suggestions for, um, certainly to include that, but also how we might be able to include that as part of the process. So October, as I mentioned, we talked community benefit agreements back in July or August. Um, and there was a lot of requests for we got to know a little bit more here. So we talked a little bit more. There was a lot of topics that people wanted more information, and so we did another meeting where we talked about those topics. So people really wanted to know a little bit more about categories, what community's role might be in these, and more on the outreach, engagement, and public meeting requirements. So how to do all of that. Um, and so we shared a little bit more. What we talked about is, there was some difficulty here, right? Answering who defines community is not, or how to define community is not an easy question to answer. We shared a couple examples of like places like the city of Detroit and their neighborhood advisory council for their community benefit ordinance. Um, People had a lot of concerns. Everybody had concerns about this at this meeting and elsewhere of, um, who's to say that the people on a group like that represent community? How could, or, if you use, um, existing groups, who's to say that that represents the community of, wherever you might be? So lots of concerns, lots of questions about how that might work. Um, how do you address representativeness? How do you think about all of these different factors that just makes it really tough to decide what to do here? So we're still thinking about this, um, how to work on defining community. Um, but we did get lots of suggestions on what else we could do. So we heard a lot of the same suggestions at the previous work session, such as using a lot of different communication methods, different public meetings, different notices, different ways to try and engage people, bring people into this process. Um, we did get a little bit more into the details about, okay, if we're talking about types of benefits or different benefits, how do we maybe prioritize things? So do we focus on something like what's the direct impact from the facility here, and maybe the benefits should focus on offsetting those impacts, or then following those up with other options as needed? So lots of ideas, lots of things we're still noodling on right now as well. Uh, so November, uh, our last work session, we talked, again, sort of a long window between when we first talked about it in July and then when we last talked about it in November. Um, People wanted more details, and so that's what this session was all about. We started, um, in that first session, we had a huge list of maybe 100 different data sets that we could use. So in this session, we kind of whittled that down um, from that original 100, and we put it into sort of yes, no, maybe piles. Like, yes, we think these are probably going to go forward. No, we don't think these aren't based on, there's maybe something that's not working. Or and then the maybe pile, everything in the middle where it's not, that maybe doesn't fit perfectly, or maybe we don't have all the information we'd like. But we shared a lot of that and a lot more detail on why we were thinking about those individual data sets. We gave folks an opportunity. We had some little dots that people could help vote on a big poster board of, which ones do you like, which ones don't you like. Um, and there was a lot of concerns. There was a lot of feedback that came out of this meeting too. So what happens if a data isn't available, which we're in the middle of right now? We have some material that we were looking at previously that's no longer available because it's not on EPA websites or elsewhere anymore. Um, Suggestions of, are we only looking at negative impacts? You know, what if there's a positive impact from something? We don't want to necessarily just focus on the negative side, but how do we think about, is there a benefit? Um, this process is going to do something that's going to improve one of these indicators or improve one of these stressors. Do we account for that as well? And then not only thinking about it individually, but how do we avoid silos? Because this is all cumulative impacts, right? So how do we avoid thinking about one thing by itself? How do we think about potentially interactions across the data? Um, and then big picture, this is a lot of information. So how does anybody, whether you're a community member, whether you're a facility, people at PCA, how do you look at this? How do you act on this information? Um, and how can MPCA specifically work to involve more community perspectives? So again, lots to think about as we move forward. And so that's what we kind of want to talk about next is where, like, let's give you that quick look at what you've specifically given us, what Minnesotans have specifically given us over the last year and a half is shaping where we're going. So I wanted to give you sort of the preview of what we're thinking about for when an analysis is required following either the benchmarks or the petition. We'll talk a little bit about this data app that we're creating to help house all of these data sets that we just talked about. And then we'll talk about community benefits agreements, a little bit more on the process, content, and how we're going to do, how we're thinking about engagement, outreach, and community participation. So when we think, when is an analysis required? These are two areas that the legislature gave us, sort of this mandatory and discretionary side, the benchmark and the petition process side. So we have a lot to come up with here. So let's talk big picture. From these meetings, it was, one of the things that everybody wanted was clear expectations. How do we know when this is required? Make it really clear when it's mandatory, when it's discretionary. Um, People are really interested in comparing, if we have examples elsewhere, how does this compare elsewhere? Do we have other tools that exist around the country elsewhere, other rules that exist? And then there's sort of this interest in, we don't necessarily want everything because everything is a lot. So how do we identify those projects or types of facilities that have the potential for greatest impact? Do we want to do this for everything because that might be a little overwhelming, or do we want to focus on those ones and not necessarily do this for every project or for every permit that's coming through? Some other ideas that came out of this, instead, how about instead we just is there maybe a way to focus instead on lowering pollutant emissions before requiring an analysis? So eh, the idea of prevention. If you prevent the pollution, that seems better than reducing or mitigating the impacts of the pollution. Do we think about, or suggestions to think about. What about vulnerable groups? If there's schools or daycares nearby, should things be slightly different, or should that be a specific question that if they are nearby, do we do more there? Or is it easier to is it a lower bar to enter the process to needing to do a cumulative impacts analysis? And then, again, kind of back to the idea of um, not everybody is going to be a technical expert. So can MPCA provide data and tools that help out there? So whether it's, just collecting information um, that community members could use or others could use to help put together um, an argument or something that would help could qualify as material evidence for something like a petition process. And so speaking of the petition process, again, couple big picture concerns, big picture ideas here. Um, People had a lot of concerns about the process for collecting signatures. Um, is this, does it have to be handwritten? Can it be digital? Can it be electronic signatures? Does it have to be people that live in the environmental justice area? And I say that as an example of this is one thing that the statutes are specific about. Um, for this petition process, it does have to be somebody that lives in or owns property in that impacted environmental justice area. So also want to be transparent and say there's some parts of this that we're interested in all questions and comments that you might have, and we're also going to try and be upfront with you when we know that that's something that we can't do or is maybe potentially really difficult to do, and there might be more explanation needed. So help us understand and build that justification if that's what you're interested in. And again, really big picture question. Uh, the term material evidence appears in the statutory language in the law, but the legislature didn't define it. So what do we say qualifies as material evidence? What are we going to set as sort of the guidelines, the guardrails for what we will look at as part of reviewing a petition or deciding if somebody needs to do a cumulative impacts analysis? And then communities suggested, hey, if we can give you some information, we think MPCA, you should do additional fact finding based on that information. We're not going to be the technical experts, but you are. So you should be able to take the information we give you and decide if there's more that you can do with it. So I mentioned impacted environmental justice area. This is another area. So people ask, well, what does that mean? Is this another like community? How do we decide what that is? Because this is also going to matter at the beginning of the process. If you're doing a petition and you're gathering signatures for a project, um, and they have to be in that impacted area, it's kind of important that you know what that area is. Um, so that's a topic that we're thinking about. Um, Other ideas, I mentioned, can people who don't live in the area sign a petition? No is the answer there. But questions too of like MPCA, do you involve your environmental justice advisory group as part of reviewing the petitions that come in potentially? So lots of ideas that we're thinking about based on the information that you've shared with us. So now let's talk a little bit about if we are doing this analysis, what does it look at? And there's kind of two parts here. So when we're looking at the contents and we're looking at, making sort of scoring an analysis, when is an impact a substantial adverse impact that leads to the community benefit agreement? Um, what do we think about? And this is kind of where that data app where we were talking about different data sets and tools comes in. So this is something that we're in the middle of creating. We're hard at work. This is sort of the next step of those two meetings and work sessions that we had on the data and the indicators. So we're working on creating this tool, creating some mock-ups so you all can see what this looks like, putting those concepts together so we can share them with communities, with interested parties. What we have so far we're thinking we feel pretty good about 18 different stressors because of a handful of reasons. And you can see them there, but quickly we see that these stressors, this information is included elsewhere, whether it's in different tools that look at impacts across the country. Um, we have data that's high quality and covers Minnesota statewide. And we're trying to make sure we're being pretty even across the different categories, across the different themes. So we don't want everything to be just air pollution, because if we're looking at cumulative impacts, it can't just, we don't want to like unfairly favor or unfairly weight one area. So we're trying to make sure there's a good coverage of different types of issues. And then big picture here too is there's been support for these types of indicators or these types of stressors, either in working sessions, public comments, or elsewhere. Oops. So, sorry. Yes. Okay. So there we are. So take a look, where we kind of are right now. We have a smattering of different environmental stressors across areas, and we've kind of grouped these into buckets just to help it make sense. But there's things like air, water, and land pollution. We have some environmental stressors in each of those. We have things that are focused on public health. We have social factors. We have things like transportation pollution. People have expressed that transportation is a big concern, or it's a big thing in their minds. And then also things like neighborhood, what's going on around you? What's your neighborhood environment look like? Things like food insecurity, that can, all of these types of stressors we think fit the bill for what the legislature suggested we look at. But we do have more to think about. Um, we have about 10 other stressors that we're looking at, that we're thinking about right now. We feel these are kind of like that maybe pile that I mentioned earlier. We do see these in other tools as well, state or federal. We think they're, this might fit the bill, but we have a couple of concerns. This information isn't necessarily as attention grabbing in like the working sessions. Maybe it's not quite as direct of a connection to public health. There might still be it there, but maybe there's not at, in comparison to some of the other ones. Um, or there's other stressors that, look at the same idea, or the same issue, the same, that we don't want to, again, kind of double count that kind of thing. That, or maybe the data just isn't as high quality as some of the other data sets that we have, or there's maybe some logistical challenges in how we can adequately look at that as part of the tool. So we're still thinking about all of this as we move forward, but you can I again hope you can see kind of where the input you've all given us is making its way into this. So last but not least, and then I think we're almost done here before we go into what's ahead in 2025. Let's talk a little bit about community benefits agreements, right? We get to this if there's that substantial adverse impact. We've said something is too much, it's above that line, or it's crossed that line. And now we have to go to the community benefit agreement part of the process. So again, big picture here, people really wanted to see and think transparency, both from MPCA and from the regulated parties, is really important, is critical here. Again, lots of opinions on who represents community, how do we bring people into this process, and really the main point here is bringing people along, and more opportunities for input beyond just a public comment period. So you all have given us, and we're working away on, ideas for different methods for engagement, how we can share information, what we might want to do. People generally were supportive of categories or types of benefits, but they didn't want this to necessarily be, an exhaustive list, or a list of a million different options, because that might be overwhelming to think about which one do I pick, or what do we pick here in this case. And then some suggestions too on um, how do we select those benefits, or maybe how do we sort of identify a preference or a priority here? Maybe something that's more tangible. So a benefit that's tied to the impacts of the facility that helps us understand, what is enough? How have we gone far enough in this agreement? So bringing it home, almost done. Let's talk a little bit about what's on the horizon for 2025 and 2026. Um, for communications and engagement, what we did a lot in 2024. We were both tasked with that by doing a lot by the legislature, and we wanted to do more than the usual here because of how interesting this rule is to everybody in Minnesota, or many people in Minnesota. So those efforts in 2024 really focused on bringing people along in the process, learning alongside you, so you can see how the sausage is made, so to say, at the same time, sharing kind of early concepts, where we are, what we're doing, what we're looking at for research, so you can kind of see, again, we don't have all the answers. We haven't figured it all out yet, and we're asking you these questions to help us figure it out. So 2025 is not going to be a repeat of that, but outreach and engagement certainly is still going to be a big focus. It just might be different. Now, if you remember back to those working sessions when I mentioned about 2/3 of the people were there with a professional interest. Um, so 2025, what we're thinking about is how do we do something slightly different? How do we talk to people that, might be interested in this rule, but just don't know that this is going on? So we're big picture thinking about continuing our that approach that we've been doing of sharing where we are as we are, and sharing those details as we go, um, but specifically trying to do more to reach people where they are. So things like attending um, different meetings, community meetings, or events that are going on, whether it's like the Minneapolis Community Connections Conference, or a school district family night, something like that. Because we need to keep building out these concepts. So there's a lot that's going to go out into this, or that's going to go into this rule, um, both in these individual areas as well as eventually putting it all together. So how do we figure out those details? Um, how do we nail down those stressors that the data tool will look at to really help us answer when is this analysis needed, and what you actually look at in an analysis? So some questions that we're still thinking about, um, what does that analysis look like? What does a cumulative impacts analysis cover? Um, do we set something up where we look at both positive and negative impacts or contributions to stressors? Do we focus on first ways to mitigate, reduce, or eliminate those impacts? Do we borrow from other work that the PCA does already through our air emissions risk analysis or modeling for air quality standards? Um, Now, when we get to, when is an impact a significant adverse impact? We have to put this all together, right? So we have to think about, if we issue a permit and think about these stressors and the socioeconomic impact of the facility to the residents, how do we make a decision? How do we define when an impact is a significant adverse impact? Do we do something like a comparison elsewhere, like New Jersey has done, where they do a comparison to this area is experiencing greater impacts or a disproportionate impact because it's above the average that the rest of their county experiences, or the rest of the state experiences? Do we use something like, again, borrow from other work that we do? Do we use health benchmarks for inhalation that look at chronic or risk or cancer risk? And then again, thinking about community benefit agreements, how do we decide? What do we look at? How do we compare to those impacts? What is active outreach designed to achieve significant community participation? Because that's what the legislature wrote in the statute. What does that mean? What does that look like? Um, and then not only for, I mean, it's under the community benefit agreement side of things, but for this rule in general, how do we be specific enough, but also account for the unique circumstances that apply in any one area, right? Because this rule is going to apply in the 7-county metro, Duluth and Rochester. What one area experiences is uh, definitely not going to be the same as what another area experiences. Maybe there might be similarities, but it's never, I doubt it would ever be exactly the same. So lots to think about as we move forward, and we'll hopefully think about those things with you at some events coming up here. So what we're doing. So in sort of the immediate future, um, like I said, we're going to focus sort of on some community, try to talk to people where they're at, whether this is things like tabling at events, interviews, or focus groups. We put a couple up here, that we have done so far over the last month or so. Um, we tabled at the MLK statewide conference. We went to the Minneapolis Community Connections Conference. We attended the Gage School Neighborhood Family Night in Rochester. Um, so we're looking at a bunch of different options of things we could do. Spring, roughly spring, um, maybe we need to talk about a topic or an area in more detail. So stay tuned, sign up for emails, updates, so you can get a sense of, we'll probably have some additional meetings or webinars or work sessions where we want to talk about something in more detail. And then summer and fall, same sort of idea, but with the intention here of um, maybe around summertime, we'll have an overall, not rule language, but here's the concept for the rule overall. How, and give folks a chance to sit and think about that, digest, and go, what do I think? What's in here that's interesting to me? So 2026, and then we're almost done. May 2026, again, that's the deadline that the legislature gave us, is when we'll publish a notice of intent to adopt. This is the day, or this is the month, where you'll see actual rule language and the supporting justification. So you'll get to see the actual rule language that says, this is how it's all going to work. And this is the start of the very formal administrative process. We'll publish this notice in the state register. That starts the public notice and comment period. It'll include, here's when the public hearing is going to be. That's where we'll present the materials, all of the rulemaking stuff, essentially, to the administrative law judge, who will review our work and say, yay or nay, essentially. And you all and anybody who wants to attend those meetings or that hearing can give the judge your 2 cents as well. That being said, this is a public comment period, so both the public notice and public hearing could lead to changes in the rule language that you see in May versus the final version of the rules. Well, but that's the whole point of a public comment period, is things can change as a result of comments. So wrapping things up, if you want to talk, please let us know. If your group or your community or business organization, advocacy group, whoever, if you want to talk more details and specifically about an area or multiple areas, please let us know. We're happy to do that. I email me. You can see my contact information there. I just ask that if you could, please let me know what you want to talk about and maybe a general time frame that you want to talk about it. We're happy to talk about things. You just have to let us know that you want to talk about it. And if you have a community event or something that you'd like to invite us to table at or attend or present at, please let us know as well. Contact Alexa. Her email information is there as well. And she asks that you just include the details for your event and who the appropriate contact person would be. So with that, that's all we have. So if you have questions or comments, I think we're going till about 7:30, so we have about 25 minutes if there's anything you want to say. So I'll stop sharing and we can. I didn't see any comments or questions in the chat, so if you have questions, feel free. Uh, come off mute, turn on your camera if you like, and let us know. Give it maybe a minute or two here. Or if you're shy and you want to drop your question into the chat, that's totally fine too. I'll read it out for you. All right. Well, last call. Otherwise, I'm sure we all want to get dinner. I'm gonna go take a nap, I think, or just go to bed and try and get rid of this cold. So thanks, everybody. Again, if you have questions, you want to talk more, feel free, email us.